The morning after the theft dawned grey and uncertain over Ashford-on-the-Weald, the kind of English autumn morning that seemed to drain colour from the world. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind turning over the peculiar details of the previous afternoon like a jeweller examining stones for hidden flaws. She rose early, as was her habit, and took her breakfast of toast and marmalade while reviewing the events in her mind with methodical precision. By 9 o'clock, she had dressed in her best tweed and made her way to the village post office, where she purchased a newspaper and lingered longer than strictly necessary, observing the postmaster's daughter, Jennifer Blackwell, no relation to the inspector, as she sorted mail with mechanical efficiency. The girl was pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she arranged letters into their designated slots. Whether this indicated guilt or merely the anxiety of living in a village suddenly seized by scandal was impossible to determine from observation alone. It was at the grocer's, 20 minutes later, that Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ashford herself, who was selecting apples with an expression of grim determination. The widow appeared diminished somehow, as though the theft had extracted something more valuable than merely a key. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple ventured gently, "I do hope you're bearing up under this dreadful business." Mrs. Ashford turned, her face registering surprise at being addressed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to inquire. I confess I've slept not a moment. £5,000, well, the donation aspect is recoverable from insurance. But the remainder—" She lowered her voice significantly. "Christopher has suggested I might increase his quarterly allowance rather than pursue the matter further. Can you imagine? As though throwing money at the problem will make it disappear." This was interesting. Miss Marple selected an apple with deliberate slowness. "Your nephew seems quite concerned for your welfare." "Christopher is concerned for his own welfare, as he has been since childhood," Mrs. Ashford said with surprising bitterness. "His mother, my sister, was always too lenient with him. I've attempted to provide the discipline she lacked, but one cannot remake a person's character through corrective measures alone." She paused, studying Miss Marple with sudden intensity. "You were at the garden party yesterday. Did you notice anything unusual? Anything at all?" Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I noticed that several people seemed to know about the tin before you announced its contents. Not consciously, perhaps, but there was an awareness in their bearing. However," she continued, placing her apple in her basket, "knowing about the tin and knowing that it contained a key are two rather different matters." Mrs. Ashford's face grew thoughtful. Inspector Blackwell has focused his investigation on the servants and the village tradesmen. "He seems determined to conclude this is an opportunistic theft, someone who heard me mention the tin in passing and acted on impulse. And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, "it seems to have required considerable planning. The timing was precise. The thief knew exactly when you would be absent from your study, exactly where the tin would be, and exactly what it would contain. That suggests not impulse, but rather intimate knowledge of your household and habits." Over the following 3 days, the village settled into the peculiar rhythm of an investigation that produced no obvious suspects. Inspector Blackwell made his rounds, taking statements and asking pointed questions, but the missing key remained missing, and the safe remained sealed. The church donation was recovered through insurance, a small mercy that seemed to mollify the vicar, if not Mrs. Ashford herself. It was on the 4th morning that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Edmund Gray, the village solicitor, appeared at her cottage door with an expression of barely suppressed urgency. He was a thin man of 60, with the careful movements of someone perpetually conscious of propriety, and his visit to an unmarried lady, even one of Miss Marple's advanced years, was notable enough to warrant comment. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not imposing," he began, accepting her offer of tea with visible relief. "I find myself in a rather delicate position, and I thought perhaps you might offer some perspective. You were at Thornfield yesterday, and I believe you to be a woman of considerable insight. You are kind to say so, Miss Marple replied, pouring his tea with steady hands. Though I confess I'm uncertain how I might assist with a matter that seems clearly within the inspector's domain. The thing is, Gray continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, I happen to know something about Mrs. Ashford's financial situation that she has not disclosed to Inspector Blackwell, and I'm bound by professional confidentiality from revealing it myself. But if someone else were to discover it through their own investigation— He trailed off meaningfully. Miss Marple set down her teapot. You're suggesting that Mrs. Ashford's £5,000 represents something other than casual savings? I'm suggesting nothing, Gray said carefully. I'm merely indicating that the financial picture surrounding Thornfield Manor is considerably more complex than it appears. Mrs. Ashford has recently made certain arrangements regarding her estate, arrangements that involve her nephew quite substantially. Miss Marple's hands remained perfectly still as she lifted her cup to her lips. Here, at last, was something approaching a genuine motive. Not for theft, perhaps, but for something far more consequential. The mint tin, she was beginning to realize, was not the true mystery at all. It was merely a symptom of something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface of civility and routine for far longer than any of them had recognized. Mr. Gray, she said at last, I believe you have been most helpful, though perhaps not in the manner you intended. After Edmund Gray's departure, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon in her garden, ostensibly tending to her roses, but in reality reconstructing the architecture of the crime in her mind. The solicitor's careful revelation had opened a door, but she needed to understand precisely what lay behind it. Financial arrangements, he had said, estate modifications. These were the language of inheritance, of expectation disappointed or fulfilled. By evening, she had determined that a visit to the village library was necessary. Miss Marple rarely required books for entertainment. Her own observations of human nature provided sufficient material for study, but the library's collection of back issues of the local newspaper sometimes contained valuable context. Mrs. Harrington, the librarian, was a woman of considerable organizational skill and even more considerable nosiness, making her an ideal source of historical information. Miss Marple, Mrs. Harrington greeted her with undisguised delight. I haven't seen you in weeks. Are you researching something for the church fundraiser? Merely curious about local history? Miss Marple replied vaguely, settling herself at a table near the microfiche machines. What she sought was information about Christopher Ashford's background, his time in London, and any circumstance that might explain his sudden return to the village after an absence of nearly 5 years. What she discovered was both illuminating and troubling. Approximately 6 years prior, there had been a minor scandal involving a Christopher Ashford in London, not directly, but mentioned in connection with a failed investment scheme that had cost several elderly investors considerable sums. The article was vague. The charges apparently dropped, but the implication was clear. Christopher had always possessed an appetite for other people's money. More recently, within the past year, there had been announcements of Mrs. Ashford's attendance at various charity events and solicitors' appointments, the kind of social notices that suggested someone actively managing their affairs. And then, 3 months ago, Christopher Ashford had returned to Ashford-on-the-Weald. The timing was not coincidental. By the following afternoon, Miss Marple had positioned herself in the village tea-room at precisely 2 o'clock, which was when Sally the housemaid typically took her half-day off. The girl was a nervous creature of 19, with red-rimmed eyes and the harried expression of someone carrying secrets too heavy for her years. Sally, Miss Marple said gently, inviting the maid to join her with a wave of her hand. I wonder if you might help me understand something about the day of the garden party. You were working, I believe. Sally's face paled. I wasn't involved in any theft, Miss Marple, if that's what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Miss Marple assured her. I'm merely curious about the household's movements. When Mrs. Ashford excused herself from the garden, did you happen to notice where anyone went? Or who was where? The maid's fingers twisted around her teacup handle. I was in the kitchen mostly, but I did see Mr. Christopher go toward the study about 5 minutes after Mrs. Ashford left the garden. I thought it was odd because he's usually not one for reading or paperwork. And when did he emerge? Almost immediately, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later. He looked, I don't know, strange, worried maybe. He went straight back outside. This confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Christopher had been in the study, but not to take the key. Or had he? The timing was too compressed, the window too narrow, unless, of course, he had known precisely where to look and what he sought. Sally, did you happen to notice whether Mrs. Ashford kept the mint tin on her desk, or whether it was stored elsewhere? Oh, it was in the left-hand drawer, Miss Marple, the top drawer. Mrs. Ashford always kept it there. Everyone who worked in the house knew that. Everyone, Miss Marple reflected, included the nephew who had recently returned from London with motivations that were increasingly transparent. But taking the key himself would have been far too obvious. Inspector Blackwell would have questioned him immediately, and his presence in the study at the critical moment would have been difficult to explain away, unless the theft was meant to appear to be something entirely different from what it actually was. That evening, Miss Marple took out her writing paper and composed a careful letter to Inspector Blackwell. She suggested, in her most delicate phrasing, that he might wish to examine Mrs. Ashford's will and any recent modifications to it. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it might be worth determining whether Christopher Ashford had access to a key of his own making, or whether he had perhaps employed someone else to conduct the actual theft. What she did not mention, what she would not mention until she had verified her theory, was that the true mystery was not who had taken the key, but rather why Mrs. Ashford herself had been so quick to announce the theft and what she stood to gain from the resulting chaos. Because Miss Marple, who had observed human nature for nearly 90 years, recognized in Mrs. Ashford's reaction the peculiar intensity of someone not discovering a crime, but orchestrating one. The widow had directed attention away from herself with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, and now the entire village was focused on finding a thief who might never have existed at all. Inspector Blackwell arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on a Thursday morning, his expression a mixture of professional skepticism and grudging interest. He carried with him a leather folder containing Mrs. Ashford's will, probate documents, and the financial records that Edmund Gray had reluctantly provided once the inspector had applied appropriate legal pressure. "I'm not entirely certain what you've led me to discover, Miss Marple," he began, settling himself in her parlor with visible discomfort. "But it appears your instincts were sound. Mrs. Ashford's will has been altered 3 times in the past 6 months. Initially, the bulk of her estate was to be divided equally between her nephew and the village church. The most recent version leaves nearly everything to Christopher, with only a small bequest to the church." "And the modifications occurred in what time frame precisely?" Miss Marple inquired, already knowing the answer. "The final modification was made exactly 2 weeks before the garden party," Blackwell confirmed, which raises the question of what prompted such a sudden change in her intentions. Edmund Gray maintains attorney-client privilege regarding her reasons, though he did admit that Mrs. Ashford seemed unusually agitated during their meeting. Miss Marple poured tea with measured deliberation. "Inspector, I wonder if you've considered that the theft itself might be the answer to your question. Not the consequence of Mrs. Ashford's changed will, but the cause of it." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "Explain." "Mrs. Ashford discovered that someone, almost certainly her nephew, was attempting to access her safe. Rather than confront him directly, which would have been emotionally difficult and potentially legally complicated, she orchestrated the theft herself. She removed the key, announced the crime, and then allowed the investigation to proceed. The result is that everyone's attention, including the inspectors, has been focused outward on finding a thief, when in reality, Mrs. Ashford was conducting her own investigation into Christopher's intentions. "That's a considerable theory," Blackwell said slowly, "but it requires proof. How would she have known that he was planning to access the safe?" "Because he would have asked her for the key," Miss Marple replied simply, "or attempted to obtain it through charm or manipulation. Mrs. Ashford is not a woman easily deceived, Inspector, but she is a woman of sentiment. Upon discovering that her nephew was capable of such deception, she would have taken action to protect both her finances and her legal arrangements." Over the next 2 days, the investigation shifted direction with subtle but decisive momentum. Inspector Blackwell interviewed Christopher Ashford again, this time with a more pointed focus on his activities in the study during the garden party. Christopher's explanations grew increasingly tangled. He had gone to retrieve a book, to look for his aunt's address book, to check on some estate matter that had suddenly seemed urgent. More damningly, a careful examination of the study's furnishings revealed that the left-hand desk drawer, where Sally had confirmed the tin was kept, bore scratches consistent with forced entry. Not recently, the marks were several weeks old, suggesting an earlier, unsuccessful attempt to open it. Someone had tried to access that drawer before the garden party. The effort had left evidence. Christopher's composure fractured when presented with this discovery. He admitted, in a voice stripped of its usual charm, that he had indeed attempted to locate the key some weeks earlier, motivated by financial difficulties in London that he had been unable to resolve independently. He had hoped his aunt might be willing to provide an advance on his inheritance, and when she had refused, he had grown desperate enough to search for alternative means of access. What he maintained with absolute consistency was that he had not stolen the key on the day of the garden party. He had seen his aunt go into the study, had realized that his moment was slipping away, and had made one final desperate attempt to find the drawer accessible. When he found it locked still, he had abandoned the effort and returned to the garden. "Then who took the key?" Inspector Blackwell demanded, his frustration evident. Miss Marple, who had been invited to observe these later interrogations in her capacity as a concerned citizen with relevant observations, answered quietly from her corner seat. "I suspect, Inspector, that Mrs. Ashford took it herself. She removed it from the tin, discovered evidence of her nephew's attempted break-in, and then announced the theft to accomplish several objectives simultaneously. She frightened Christopher sufficiently that he would no longer attempt further manipulation. She created a situation that would justify consulting with her solicitor regarding the modification of her will. And most importantly, she established irrefutable evidence of his character, which would protect any future legal arrangements." "But the key was never found," Blackwell protested. "If she took it herself, where is it?" "Destroyed, I would imagine," Miss Marple said, "or hidden in a location known only to herself. The key's physical existence became irrelevant once its absence served her purposes." The inspector's face darkened with the realization that he had been, in a sense, playing out a drama orchestrated entirely by Mrs. Ashford herself. "This entire investigation has been a test," Miss Marple completed gently. "Mrs. Ashford has learned what she needed to know about her nephew's character and his desperation. Christopher will likely face no criminal charges, as there is no evidence of actual theft. But his aunt has effectively neutralized his threat to her estate and her peace of mind. In the aftermath, I suspect she will maintain her modified will, precisely as it stands." Inspector Blackwell stood to leave, his professional dignity somewhat restored by the confirmation that no actual crime had occurred, even if he had been manipulated into conducting an investigation into a non-existent theft. At the door, he paused. "How did you know, Miss Marple? How could you have possibly understood what was really happening?" Miss Marple smiled enigmatically. "Because I have observed, over many years, that women of Mrs. Ashford's character do not panic when their possessions are threatened. They act. And when they act with such theatrical precision, it is always because they are protecting something far more valuable than money." The village of Ashford-on-the-Weald did not return to normalcy precisely. but rather settled into a new arrangement of itself, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. The case remained officially closed, the theft attributed to an unknown perpetrator who had never been apprehended and likely never would be. Inspector Blackwell filed his report with the kind of bureaucratic acceptance that suggested he preferred not to examine too closely the peculiar logic of events he did not fully understand. Christopher Ashford remained at Thornfield Manor, though his presence had acquired a different quality. Where once he had moved through the village with the careless confidence of a favored nephew, he now possessed the careful reserve of someone aware that he was being observed. He took fewer trips to London, spent more time attending to actual estate matters, and maintained a distance from his aunt that was polite but emotionally vast. The transformation was not complete redemption, but rather a recognition that certain doors had been permanently closed to him. It was Mrs. Ashford herself who surprised everyone by calling upon Miss Marple exactly 1 week after Inspector Blackwell's final report had been filed. She arrived in her motor car promptly at 3 o'clock, dressed in her finest grey silk, carrying a small leather box that she placed on Miss Marple's lap with an expression of complicated gratitude. "I owe you an explanation," Mrs. Ashford began without preamble, settling herself in the chair opposite with the posture of someone unaccustomed to apologies. "Though I suspect you have already constructed one yourself, based on whatever peculiar observations led you to the truth." Miss Marple opened the box and found within it the missing key, polished to a bright shine, resting on a bed of velvet. She said nothing, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that Mrs. Ashford needed to speak more than she needed to be questioned. "My sister was a weak woman," Mrs. Ashford continued, her voice carrying the weight of old resentments. "Indulgent with Christopher in ways that I have never understood. When she died, I made a promise to myself that I would provide him with the discipline she lacked, the guidance that might still salvage some decent character from the materials she had provided. For years, I believed this was possible. I gave him allowances, secured his education, attempted to steer him toward respectable employment." She paused, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. "Then, about 8 months ago, I learned through Edmund Gray, who was bound by professional discretion but sufficiently horrified to hint at the facts, that Christopher had engaged in activities in London that bordered upon fraud. Small things, perhaps, but accumulated into a pattern, and I realized that my efforts had been entirely futile. I could not transform him. I could only contain the damage he might inflict." "So you set a trap," Miss Marple said gently. "I set a test," Mrs. Ashford corrected. "I wanted to know whether he would steal from me directly, or whether his desperation had reached that point. I deliberately left the tin accessible, mentioned its location to various people, and waited. When I discovered the scratches on the drawer, I knew what I needed to know, so I removed the key, announced the theft, and allowed events to proceed as they naturally would." "And the result?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew. "The result is that I have modified my will to leave the bulk of my estate to Christopher, but with conditions. The money will be held in trust by Edmund Gray, distributed to him in quarterly amounts insufficient to support the kinds of schemes that tempted him in London. He will have enough to live comfortably, but not enough to gamble with. It is not the solution I would have chosen, but it is the only one that acknowledges both his weakness and his essential nature." Miss Marple returned the key to its box. "You are a woman of considerable courage, Mrs. Ashford, though not, I suspect, the sort that is celebrated in novels and newspapers." "I am a woman who has learned that love and practicality are not always compatible," Mrs. Ashford replied. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I wonder, Miss Marple, if you understand why I've come to you with this confession. It is not to absolve myself of deception, but rather to ensure that someone in this village understands the truth. When I'm gone, the mythology of the stolen key will fade, replaced by some other scandal. But I wanted someone to know that Christopher's redemption, whatever form it takes, began not with theft, but with a recognition of weakness. That is worth something, I think." After Mrs. Ashford's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the leather box resting on the table beside her cup of now cold tea. She reflected upon the curious nature of justice in small villages, where the law operated according to formal rules, while actual truth moved in more mysterious currents. Christopher Ashford would spend the rest of his life in the village, constrained by modest quarterly distributions and the knowledge that his aunt understood precisely what he was capable of. Mrs. Ashford would carry to her grave the weight of having sacrificed her own hopes for her nephew in order to protect her estate, and the village itself would forever wonder about the mysterious theft that had never quite been solved. But Miss Marple understood that this was precisely how such matters should conclude. The key had been missing from the tin because Mrs. Ashford had removed it, not to commit theft, but to acknowledge a profound and irrevocable truth about human nature. And in doing so, she had taught her nephew something far more valuable than any amount of money could provide: the knowledge that he was known completely and loved despite that knowledge. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Ashford's visit, and the village had begun to settle into the unremarkable rhythm of late autumn. The church restoration fund had been replenished through insurance claims. The garden party scandal had been relegated to the status of historical gossip, and most residents of Ashford on the Weald had moved their attention to more pressing concerns: the approaching holiday season, the minor scandal involving the vicar's assistant and the organist, and the perpetual question of whether the winter would be particularly harsh. Miss Marple, however, had become aware of a subtle disturbance in this restored equilibrium, one that revealed itself through the careful observation of social patterns. It began with small things: Mrs. Pettigrew's sudden reluctance to discuss Mrs. Ashford's affairs, Edmund Gray's increasingly frequent visits to Thornfield Manor at unusual hours, and most tellingly, Sally the housemaid's nervous habit of glancing over her shoulder whenever she encountered Miss Marple in the village. On the morning of November 15th, as Miss Marple was arranging flowers in her front garden, Sally appeared at her gate with the desperate expression of someone who had been carrying a secret too heavy for solitary bearing. "Miss Marple," the girl began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you privately, about something I saw, something I haven't told anyone." Within the hour, Sally sat in Miss Marple's parlour, her tea untouched, her fingers working nervously at the seams of her skirt. What she revealed was the sort of detail that would have seemed insignificant to most observers, but which Miss Marple recognized immediately as the thread that, when pulled, might unravel everything that had been so carefully constructed during the weeks following the theft. "It was about 10 days ago," Sally explained. "I was cleaning the upper corridor at Thornfield, the one that leads to the storage rooms. I heard voices coming from the study, Mr. Christopher and someone else, a woman. At first I thought it was Mrs. Ashford, but the voice was different, younger, and they were arguing." "What was the nature of their disagreement?" Miss Marple asked, though she sensed she already knew the answer. "Money," Sally said simply. "The woman kept saying that she had done what was asked, that she had kept quiet, and that now she expected to be compensated. She said something like, 'You promised me £500 for my cooperation, and I've held my tongue while everyone in this village speculated about your guilt.' And Mr. Christopher was telling her that the arrangement had changed, that he couldn't pay her now because of the modified will." Miss Marple's hands stilled in her lap. The architecture of the crime, the real crime, not the elaborate theatrical performance that Mrs. Ashford had orchestrated, suddenly revealed itself in terrible clarity. Christopher had not acted alone in his attempt to access the safe. He had employed someone, likely someone with access to Thornfield Manor, someone whose cooperation could be easily explained away as coincidental. "Did you recognize the woman's voice?" Miss Marple asked carefully. Sally hesitated, clearly wrestling with loyalty and conscience. "I think," she said finally, "I think it was Miss Jennifer Blackwell from the post office, the inspector's daughter, but I couldn't be completely certain. I didn't see her, only heard her through the door." After Sally's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour for a considerable time, her mind processing the implications of this revelation. Jennifer Blackwell was not a woman of significant means, which made financial inducement a powerful motivator. She was also, if Miss Marple's memory served, someone with a connection to Christopher Ashford, a connection that had flourished during his time in London and had apparently been renewed upon his return to the village. The question was no longer who had stolen the key, but rather why Christopher had felt the need to break his promise of payment to Jennifer. The answer, of course, lay in Mrs. Ashford's modification of her will. With the bulk of the estate now tied up in trust and distributed in modest quarterly increments, Christopher himself had become financially constrained. The £500 he had promised to Jennifer represented a sum he could no longer easily produce without drawing attention to his altered circumstances. Miss Marple recognized in this situation a peculiar and dangerous equilibrium. Jennifer Blackwell was unlikely to take her complaint to the authorities. Doing so would expose her own role in Christopher's attempted theft and destroy her reputation in the village permanently. But she possessed leverage, and leverage, Miss Marple had learned through many years of observation, was a commodity that people were willing to exploit in ways both subtle and devastating. She rose from her chair and retrieved her coat. A visit to the post office seemed warranted, though not for the purpose of purchasing stamps. As she walked through the village, she reflected upon the curious way that one revelation often concealed rather than illuminated the true nature of events. Mrs. Ashford had orchestrated her theatrical theft, believing that she had successfully contained her nephew's capacity for wrongdoing. What she had not anticipated was that Christopher, desperate and clever, had already enlisted assistance in his schemes, and that assistance would not simply dissolve because its compensation had been delayed. The mint tin, it seemed, had contained more than one kind of key. And now, as Miss Marple approached the post office, she understood that the investigation was far from over. Indeed, it had only just begun to reveal the darker currents that ran beneath the surface of village life. Currents that pulled good people toward moral compromise and ambition toward criminality. The true mystery, Miss Marple realized, was not who had stolen the key, but rather what would happen when the people who had been bound together by that theft discovered that their arrangement was beginning to unravel. The post office of Ashford-on-the-Weald occupied a small corner building painted in cheerful cream and green, its windows displaying parcels and official notices, in an arrangement that suggested both efficiency and gentle neglect. Jennifer Blackwell stood behind the counter, sorting mail with the methodical precision of someone performing a task, while her mind occupied elsewhere. She was pale, thinner than Miss Marple remembered from the garden party, with dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of troubled sleep. "Miss Marple," Jennifer said, looking up from her work with barely concealed anxiety. "I wasn't expecting to see you. Is there something I can help you with?" "I wish to purchase some writing paper," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "But I find myself wondering if you might have a moment for a private conversation first. Perhaps in the back room? I believe you have a small office there." The color drained from Jennifer's face. She glanced toward her father, who was in the rear sorting correspondence, then back to Miss Marple. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I suspect you are quite certain what I mean," Miss Marple said gently. "But I also suspect you would prefer that conversation to occur away from your workplace, away from your father's hearing. Shall we?" Within minutes, they were seated in the cramped back office, surrounded by shelves of parcels and sorting equipment. Jennifer's hands trembled as she folded and refolded a piece of postal paper. "You know," Jennifer said finally, abandoning any pretense of innocence, "how much do you know? I know that Christopher Ashford promised you money in exchange for your assistance with something, access to the house, perhaps, or information about Mrs. Ashford's habits and the location of valuables. I know that you kept your silence when everyone in the village was speculating about the theft. and I know that Mr. Ashford has subsequently found himself unable to fulfill his financial obligation to you." Jennifer's face crumpled. "He said it would be simple. He said his aunt kept cash in the safe, that if we could just get the key, he could borrow what he needed to repay his debts in London. He promised me £500, a fortune to someone in my position. I was going to use it to leave this village, to start fresh somewhere that no one knew me." "But the plan went awry," Miss Marple observed. "Mrs. Ashford discovered the attempted break-in and removed the key herself, orchestrating what appeared to be a theft in order to assess her nephew's character and motivations. He told me what his aunt had done," Jennifer continued, her voice bitter. "After the investigation concluded, he explained that she had taken the key and pretended it was stolen. He seemed almost impressed by her cleverness, as though she had demonstrated superior wit. But then he told me that he couldn't pay me because his aunt had modified her will, restricting his access to the family money. He said I would simply have to be patient, that he would compensate me once he gained full control of the estate." "How long was that supposed to require?" Miss Marple asked. "Mrs. Ashford is 73 years old," Jennifer said flatly. "Healthy, as far as I know. He was asking me to wait potentially decades for money he had promised me immediately. And I'd already committed myself to keeping quiet about my involvement. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police and confess that I'd helped him attempt to rob his own aunt?" Miss Marple recognized in Jennifer's situation the peculiar trap that moral compromise created. The girl had believed herself to be participating in a relatively harmless scheme, stealing from a wealthy woman to help a man in financial distress. The reality, however, was far more complicated. She was now implicated in an attempted theft, her reputation in the village was compromised, and the person who had promised her protection and compensation had essentially abandoned her to her own devices. "I wonder," Miss Marple said carefully, "if Mr. Ashford has approached you recently regarding a more permanent solution to his financial difficulties?" Jennifer's silence was answer enough. "He has suggested something to you," Miss Marple continued. "Something that seems to offer a way out of your current predicament. Something that would benefit him considerably and compensate you for your trouble." "He mentioned," Jennifer said slowly, "that if something were to happen to his aunt, an accident perhaps, or a sudden illness, he would inherit immediately. He said that I could be taken care of properly then. He said he valued my loyalty and would ensure that I was rewarded." The words hung in the air like a confession, though Miss Marple noted that Jennifer had been careful not to specify exactly what something Christopher had suggested might occur. Nevertheless, the implication was unmistakable. Christopher Ashford, constrained by his modified will and desperate for access to his inheritance, had begun to hint at the possibility of his aunt's premature death. "Has he provided you with any specific suggestions regarding how such an event might be engineered?" Miss Marple asked, her voice remaining neutral. "No," Jennifer said firmly, "and I told him that I wanted nothing to do with any such scheme. I told him that I would keep his secret about the attempted theft, but that I would not be party to anything more serious. He seemed to accept that, but there was something in his manner that frightened me. Something that suggested he was merely waiting for me to change my mind." Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate slowness. "Miss Blackwell, I must insist that you speak to Inspector Blackwell about this conversation, not about your involvement in the attempted theft. That matter is concluded, and confessing it would accomplish nothing but your own destruction. Rather, you must inform him of Mr. Ashford's suggestions regarding his aunt's demise. Vague though they may be, they constitute a potential threat to Mrs. Ashford's safety." "But he'll know I told you," Jennifer protested. "He'll know that I've betrayed him." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "which means you will need to leave Ashford on the Weald as soon as it can be arranged. The £500 you were promised may never materialize, but the constable's protection and a fresh start in another town will prove far more valuable in the long term." Inspector Blackwell arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that evening with the expression of a man confronting a truth he would have preferred to remain ignorant of. He carried a leather notebook and the weight of professional obligation, though Miss Marple detected beneath his official manner a current of genuine distress. He had, after all, known Christopher Ashford since the young man's childhood and had always maintained cordial relations with Mrs. Ashford. "Jennifer Blackwell has made a statement," he began without preamble, accepting the tea Miss Marple offered with automatic courtesy. "She corroborates your suspicion that Christopher Ashford was responsible for the attempted break-in and that she provided him with assistance in exchange for promised compensation. However, her allegation regarding threats to Mrs. Ashford's life is considerably more serious, and I confess I'm uncertain how to proceed." "What precisely did Miss Blackwell report?" Miss Marple inquired, though she could anticipate the general contours of Jennifer's confession. "She claims that Ashford made vague suggestions that his aunt might experience a fatal accident or illness in the near future, and that such an event would greatly improve his financial circumstances. She stated that he implied she would be rewarded for her continued discretion and loyalty should such an event occur. However," Blackwell emphasized, "he made no specific threats, no direct proposal of harm, and no concrete plan. A solicitor would argue, quite reasonably, that these comments constitute mere speculation rather than a criminal conspiracy." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Inspector, I wonder if you have considered the possibility that Mr. Ashford has already begun to implement whatever scheme he has conceived, not through direct violence, but through methods considerably more subtle and potentially more effective." "What do you mean?" Blackwell leaned forward, his notebook momentarily forgotten. "Mrs. Ashford has been in excellent health so far as I'm aware," Miss Marple said slowly. "However, I have observed in recent days that she has appeared somewhat diminished, fatigued perhaps, and experiencing minor digestive disturbances. Matters that one might easily attribute to age or stress rather than anything more sinister." "You believe he's poisoning her?" Blackwell's voice carried the note of a man hearing his worst suspicions articulated aloud. "I believe it's a possibility that warrants investigation," Miss Marple replied, "particularly given that Christopher would have ready access to Mrs. Ashford's food and beverages. A substance administered in small doses over an extended period, arsenic perhaps, or some other toxin that produces cumulative effects, might produce symptoms consistent with age-related illness. Mrs. Ashford herself might not recognize the pattern, and her physician might attribute her condition to natural causes." Blackwell stood abruptly, pacing the small parlor with evident agitation. "If this is true, then Jennifer Blackwell is potentially complicit in attempted murder. She knew of his intentions and did nothing." Miss Blackwell stated that she refused his suggestions and warned him against pursuing such a course, Miss Marple said carefully. "Whether she is guilty of complicity depends upon the determination of what she knew, when she knew it, and what actions she took in response. These are matters for the law to determine, not for me to judge." "Nevertheless," Blackwell said, "I must speak with Mrs. Ashford immediately. If Ashford is engaged in such a scheme, she requires protection." "I would suggest, Inspector, that you approach this matter with considerable delicacy," Miss Marple cautioned. "If you confront Mrs. Ashford directly regarding the possibility of poisoning, you will alert Christopher to the fact that his intentions have been discovered. A guilty man, aware that suspicion is turning toward him, might take drastic action. It would be preferable to observe his behavior under the assumption that his scheme remains undiscovered." Blackwell paused in his pacing. "You're suggesting we set a trap?" "I'm suggesting that we allow him to believe his method is succeeding while simultaneously taking steps to ensure Mrs. Ashford's actual safety. A physician could be consulted, ostensibly regarding her reported fatigue, but actually to examine her for signs of poisoning and to provide her with genuine medical care. Meanwhile, her food and beverages could be carefully monitored and analyzed." Within the hour, a discreet meeting had been arranged at the home of Dr. Harrington, the village's only physician. Inspector Blackwell explained the situation with professional restraint, presenting it as a precaution based on rumors and speculation rather than concrete evidence. Dr. Harrington, a man of considerable discretion and intelligence, understood immediately the gravity of the situation and agreed to conduct both a thorough examination of Mrs. Ashford and a careful analysis of any food or drink samples she could provide. The following morning, Mrs. Ashford received a summons to Dr. Harrington's surgery for what was ostensibly a routine health assessment. She arrived somewhat puzzled by the urgency and was subjected to a comprehensive examination. Blood samples were taken, her reflexes tested, her symptoms documented with meticulous care. Meanwhile, at Thornfield Manor, Sally the housemaid, now fully apprised of the investigation and acting under Inspector Blackwell's quiet authority, carefully collected samples from Mrs. Ashford's breakfast table, her afternoon tea, and her evening meal. Each sample was preserved and delivered to Dr. Harrington, who possessed sufficient knowledge of toxicology to conduct preliminary tests. The results, when they came 2 days later, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion with terrifying clarity. Traces of arsenic were present in Mrs. Ashford's blood at levels consistent with chronic, low-dose poisoning. 3 of the food samples contained minute quantities of arsenic dispersed throughout. The pattern suggested a systematic campaign of poisoning extending back at least 3 weeks, approximately the period since Christopher had learned of his modified will. Inspector Blackwell now faced a dilemma of considerable complexity. He possessed evidence of poisoning, but no direct proof that Christopher had administered it. The evidence was circumstantial, dependent upon the cooperation of a young woman who was herself implicated in criminal conspiracy. The case, he understood with grim clarity, would require Miss Marple's particular genius to resolve conclusively. The confrontation, when it came, took place not in an interrogation room at the police station, but in the drawing room at Thornfield Manor, with Miss Marple present as an ostensible witness but functioning, in reality, as the architect of revelation. Inspector Blackwell had arranged the meeting with careful attention to detail, inviting Christopher Ashford to discuss certain irregularities in the estate accounts that required his attention. Mrs. Ashford was present as well, though she had been informed only that a matter requiring her verification had arisen. Christopher arrived with his customary charm intact, though Miss Marple detected in his bearing the peculiar tension of a man whose schemes were beginning to unravel beneath the surface of apparent normality. He greeted his aunt with affection that now possessed an edge of falseness, kissed her cheek with a gesture that seemed almost predatory in its calculated intimacy. "I'm not entirely certain why this meeting was necessary," Christopher began, settling himself in the leather armchair with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding a room. "Inspector, surely estate matters could have been handled through Edmund Gray. There's no need to trouble Aunt Juliet with such tedious details." "Nevertheless," Blackwell replied, his voice carrying the formal precision of official procedure, "I felt it important that Mrs. Ashford be present. The matter concerns her well-being directly." He produced a letter written on Dr. Harrington's official stationery, documenting Mrs. Ashford's recent symptoms and the results of her medical examination. As Christopher read, his face underwent a subtle transformation, the charm receding, replaced by a calculation so transparent that even a casual observer would have recognized it. "My aunt's health concerns are hardly matters for the police," Christopher said, his voice carefully modulated. "If Dr. Harrington has identified some ailment requiring treatment, that is a private medical matter." "The ailment," Miss Marple said quietly, "is arsenic poisoning, Mr. Ashford. Administered in small doses over an extended period, calculated to produce symptoms consistent with age-related decline rather than acute toxicity." The room fell silent. Christopher's hands tightened on the armrest of his chair, though his expression remained composed. "That's an extraordinary accusation," he said finally. "One that you would require considerable evidence to substantiate." "We have evidence," Inspector Blackwell confirmed. "Food samples from your aunt's table containing traces of arsenic, blood tests indicating chronic poisoning, a timeline correlating the onset of her symptoms with your return to the village and your modification of her will. Circumstantial, Christopher countered, but his voice had lost its confidence. Any of the household staff could have access to the kitchen. Any of them might harbor resentment toward my aunt. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her aged frame belying the sharpness of her observation. What is remarkable about this case, Mr. Ashford, is not what the evidence reveals, but rather what it conceals. You are an intelligent man. That much is evident from your careful planning. The dosages have been calculated to produce minimal acute symptoms while accumulating to eventually fatal levels. The timing has been precise, designed to suggest natural illness rather than deliberate poisoning. Yet, she continued, there is one element of your scheme that reveals its human author, and that element is psychology rather than toxicology. You have poisoned your aunt while simultaneously attempting to convince her that you are her most devoted and affectionate relative. You have performed the role of the concerned nephew with theatrical precision, bringing her flowers, engaging her in conversation, expressing worry about her health. Christopher's jaw tightened. People often concern themselves with the health of their elderly relatives. Of course they do, Miss Marple agreed, but they rarely do so while simultaneously administering poisons designed to hasten that relative's demise. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such a performance, to poison someone while expressing genuine seeming affection for them, is considerable. It requires a particular type of psychological compartmentalization, a severing of emotional response from deliberate action. She rose from her chair and approached Christopher, her movements deliberate and measured. I have observed you carefully since your return to Ashford on the Weald, Mr. Ashford. I've watched how you manage your aunt's affection, how you calibrate your expressions of concern to elicit her trust and her gratitude. What struck me most forcefully was not any single action, but rather the absence of genuine feeling beneath your performance. A man truly worried about his aunt's health displays anxiety, uncertainty, moments of authentic distress. You displayed none of these things. Your concern was perfectly executed, but entirely hollow. This is psychological speculation, not evidence, Christopher said, standing to face Miss Marple directly. No court in England would convict me on the basis of your observations regarding my emotional authenticity. Perhaps not, Inspector Blackwell interjected, producing an additional document. But they might convict you on the basis of this. Jennifer Blackwell has provided a statement detailing your conversations regarding your aunt's potential demise and the financial benefits that would accrue to you. She has also agreed to testify regarding her own involvement in the attempted break-in and your subsequent suggestions that you had devised a more effective method of accessing the family resources. Christopher's face underwent another transformation, this time from controlled calculation to something far more dangerous. Jennifer would testify against me, after everything I've promised her. Miss Blackwell, Miss Marple said gently, came to understand that promises made by a man willing to poison his own aunt cannot be trusted. She chose, ultimately, to place her faith in the law rather than in your assurances. The arrest proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Christopher Ashford was formally charged with attempted murder, with the poisoning constituting the substantive crime while the theft investigation remained in legal limbo, its true nature now understood by only a handful of people. Mrs. Ashford, her health beginning to improve immediately upon cessation of the poisoning, displayed a remarkable composure as her nephew was led away by constables. I had hoped, she said to Miss Marple after the police had departed, that I had learned something about human nature. Instead, I've learned that there are depths to human depravity that even careful observation cannot fully anticipate. Miss Marple took Mrs. Ashford's hand gently. You learned, she said, that love and betrayal are not opposites, but rather two sides of the same coin. Your nephew betrayed you precisely because he was capable of loving you, or at least of performing love, convincingly. A truly heartless man would have lacked the sophistication to poison you while maintaining affection. His capacity for deception was born from a capacity for emotional performance that love itself requires. The trial of Christopher Ashford occupied the local courts for 3 weeks in early December, drawing journalists from as far as London and transforming Ashford-on-the-Weald into a temporary spectacle of public interest. The village, which had grown accustomed to mystery and revelation, found itself confronted with the uncomfortable reality of having harbored a would-be murderer within its peaceful boundaries. The proceedings were meticulous and thorough, the evidence presented with damning clarity, and the verdict, when it came, was guilty on all counts. Christopher Ashford received a sentence of 15 years with hard labor, a punishment that seemed to strike the village as simultaneously insufficient and excessively harsh, depending upon whom one asked. He departed to his cell with a composure that suggested he was merely enduring an inconvenience rather than confronting the consequences of his attempted matricide. The local newspapers carried photographs of him being escorted away, his expression unreadable, his charm finally exhausted. Jennifer Blackwell, in accordance with the arrangement negotiated between her solicitor and the Crown, received immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony. Her reputation in Ashford-on-the-Weald, however, was irreparably damaged. The village had forgiven her role in the attempted break-in. Such things were understood as the temporary misjudgment of a young woman, but her willingness to collaborate with Christopher in his scheme to poison his aunt struck deeper. Within a fortnight of the trial's conclusion, she had secured employment in Brighton, a coastal town far enough removed from the village to offer genuine anonymity. Miss Marple attended Jennifer's departure with characteristic discretion, pressing into the young woman's hand a sum of money that represented a portion of what Christopher had promised but never intended to pay. "This is not charity," Miss Marple said firmly, when Jennifer attempted to refuse. "It is rather the settlement of a debt owed by a man incapable of honor. You have chosen a difficult path, Miss Blackwell, but it is the path toward redemption. That choice deserves acknowledgement." The village itself underwent a subtle but profound transformation in the aftermath of the trial. The comfortable certainties that had sustained Ashford-on-the-Weald for generations, the belief that murder was something that occurred in cities, in newspapers, in the abstract realm of criminal theory, rather than in one's own drawing rooms, had been shattered. Mrs. Pettigrew, bereft of her assumed superior knowledge, had withdrawn somewhat from village gossip. The vicar had delivered sermons with unusual intensity, grappling with theological questions regarding the nature of sin and redemption. Edmund Gray had resigned his position as family solicitor, unwilling to maintain professional connection to a household so thoroughly marked by scandal. Mrs. Ashford herself had retreated into a private world of reflection and careful management. Her health, once restored, had become somewhat fragile, not from any lingering effects of poisoning, but rather from the profound shock of discovering that the family she had endeavored to guide with such precision contained within it a capacity for cold calculation that transcended her understanding. She maintained her position in village society, but with a diminished presence, as though the effort of upholding her accustomed role had become more than she possessed energy to sustain. It was on a grey afternoon in mid-December, 3 weeks after Christopher's sentencing, that Mrs. Ashford called upon Miss Marple for what would prove to be their final conversation. She arrived in her motor car, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing physical fragility, and settled herself in Miss Marple's parlor with the exhaustion of one who has been carrying a burden for far longer than strength permits. "I have come to thank you," Mrs. Ashford began, without preamble, "and also to offer an explanation regarding certain aspects of my conduct that you may not have fully understood. I suspect I understand them more completely than you might imagine," Miss Marple replied gently. "You orchestrated the theft of the key not merely to test your nephew's character, but because you had already begun to suspect that something darker than simple financial desperation motivated him." Mrs. Ashford's composure fractured slightly. "I found evidence," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nothing definitive, but sufficient to cause concern. A book on poisons that had been removed from the library and returned with suspicious urgency. A conversation I overheard between Christopher and an apothecary in the neighboring county regarding the properties of certain substances. When combined with his sudden return to the village and his manifest desperation regarding his financial circumstances, these fragments suggested a pattern. "So you removed the key yourself," Miss Marple continued, "and created an elaborate scenario that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. You would establish grounds for consulting with your solicitor regarding will modifications that would protect your estate regardless of Christopher's intentions. You would create a situation that would require police investigation, bringing official scrutiny to the household. And you would observe your nephew's behavior under stress, allowing you to determine whether your suspicions were justified." "I was attempting to be clever," Mrs. Ashford said bitterly, "attempting to manage a situation that I sensed was beginning to spiral beyond my control. Instead, I merely accelerated the process of revelation. Had I simply removed Christopher from the house, had I confronted him directly, had I taken more straightforward action, perhaps matters would not have progressed to actual attempts at poisoning. Or, Miss Marple suggested, matters would have proceeded exactly as they did, merely with greater secrecy and less likelihood of discovery. Your actions, though perhaps not ideal, did ultimately result in preventing a tragedy. Christopher did not succeed in poisoning you to death. He will spend his life in prison rather than inheriting your estate and using those resources to pursue whatever darkness exists within his nature." Mrs. Ashford rose to depart, moving toward the door with the weariness of defeat. At the threshold, she turned back to Miss Marple. "I've spent my life believing that one could understand human nature through careful observation and reasoned analysis. I believed that knowledge, properly applied, could shape behavior and guide people toward virtue. I have learned that I was profoundly mistaken. Some aspects of the human heart remain forever opaque, regardless of how carefully one watches." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but your mistake was not in believing that observation matters. Your error was in believing that observation alone is sufficient. Human nature contains paradoxes that reason cannot fully resolve. We can observe behavior, but we cannot always understand motivation. We can recognize patterns, but we cannot always predict outcomes. The uncertainty you now feel is not a failure of your intellect, Mrs. Ashford. It is rather an acknowledgement of the genuine complexity of human existence." After Mrs. Ashford's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor as the winter afternoon darkened into evening. She reflected, as she had throughout her long life, upon the particular tragedy of watching human beings betray themselves and those they claimed to love. The mystery of the key missing from the mint tin had been solved, yes, but in solving it, she had discovered a deeper mystery entirely, one that concerned the nature of love, betrayal, trust, and the terrible choices that people made when they believed themselves to have exhausted all other options. The Christmas season arrived in Ashford-on-the-Weald with the reluctant resignation of a village attempting to reclaim normalcy from the wreckage of scandal. Snow fell lightly on the stone cottages and the church spire, softening the landscape into an image of picturesque serenity that belied the turbulent undercurrents still flowing beneath the surface of village life. Miss Marple, now in her 91st year, watched the preparations from her garden gate with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had observed many seasons turn and many communities attempt to heal from their own self-inflicted wounds. On Christmas Eve, Inspector Blackwell called upon her with a leather-bound journal and an expression of weary resolution. He had come, he explained, to return Christopher Ashford's correspondence, which had been recovered during a search of Thornfield Manor, and now constituted part of the evidence repository for the trial record. Among these letters was one addressed to Miss Marple, discovered sealed and clearly intended for delivery, but never posted. "I thought you should see this," Blackwell said, placing the envelope in her hands with the ceremony of transferring something of considerable significance. "Not because it requires action, the case is concluded, but because I believe it may provide the insight you sought regarding his motivations." Miss Marple opened the letter with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling fragile documents. Christopher's handwriting was elegant and precise, revealing in its very penmanship a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his presentation to the world. The letter began with what might have been an apology, but read instead as justification. Christopher explained that he had never intended to harm his aunt, merely to accelerate circumstances that he believed would eventually occur naturally. He had convinced himself that Mrs. Ashford, at her advanced age, was living on borrowed time and that his actions were merely hastening an inevitable conclusion. He wrote of his debts in London, of his humiliation at having failed in his financial endeavors, of his desperate hope that access to his inheritance would provide him with a second opportunity to establish himself as a man of consequence. But it was the final paragraph that revealed something far more disturbing than mere criminal rationalization. Christopher had written of his observation of Miss Marple throughout the investigation, of his growing awareness that she understood him in ways that no one else possessed the capacity to comprehend. He had written of watching her watch him, of sensing the moment when she had crossed from suspicion to certainty. And he had written of his reluctant admiration for her intellect, coupled with his determination to prove that he possessed sufficient cunning to outwit even so formidable an observer. "He was playing a game," Miss Marple said quietly, lowering the letter to her lap. The poisoning was not merely a practical scheme to acquire his inheritance. It was a performance designed to demonstrate his superiority, a competition between his will and mine. "Did you understand that?" Blackwell asked. "During the investigation?" "Not initially," Miss Marple admitted. "I understood only that something did not align with the obvious narrative. But toward the end, when I was observing him carefully, I came to recognize in his behavior the peculiar satisfaction of a man engaged in a game whose rules only he fully comprehended. He wanted me to discover what he was doing. That was the true source of his pleasure." Blackwell departed shortly thereafter, leaving Miss Marple alone with the letter and her reflections. She spent the Christmas season in quiet contemplation, attending services at the church, accepting visits from village friends, and maintaining the routines that had structured her life for decades. Yet something had shifted in her understanding of the events that had unfolded. On Boxing Day, she composed a letter to Christopher at his place of incarceration. It was a brief communication, written in her careful hand, containing no accusations or recriminations, but rather a single observation. The true superiority of intellect consisted not in the capacity to deceive, but in the wisdom to choose honesty. She posted it without expectation of response, knowing that Christopher would likely interpret her words as yet another move in their ongoing contest of wills. As the new year approached, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the peculiar trajectory of the case, how a seemingly simple theft had unraveled into layers of deception, betrayal, and psychological complexity that challenged every assumption about human motivation. The mint tin, with its missing key, had represented not merely a crime, but a threshold between the world as people desired to believe it functioned and the world as it actually operated beneath the surface of propriety and convention. Mrs. Ashford, whom Miss Marple encountered at the village post office on New Year's Eve, appeared to have aged considerably in the months since Christopher's conviction. Yet there was about her a quality of hard-won understanding, as though she had finally accepted that the world contained darker possibilities than she had previously acknowledged. "Miss Marple," she said, approaching with visible effort, "I wanted you to know that I have established a trust fund in your name. It represents my gratitude for what you have accomplished, and also my acknowledgement that your intervention prevented a far greater tragedy than anyone has yet fully articulated." Miss Marple accepted this gesture with grace, understanding that Mrs. Ashford was engaged in her own process of redemption, the complicated work of accepting that love and betrayal could coexist within the same family, and that recognizing this truth constituted a form of wisdom rather than failure. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she reflected upon the nature of her work. For decades, she had observed villages much like Ashford-on-the-Weald, had watched as ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances, had seen how desperation and ambition could transform the most civilized individuals into something far more dangerous. The key missing from the mint tin had been, in the end, merely a symbol of absence, the absence of conscience, of genuine connection, of the capacity to love without the simultaneous impulse toward destruction. As midnight approached and the new year prepared to arrive, Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The mystery had been solved, the guilty imprisoned, and order restored to the village. Yet she understood that this peace was temporary, that human nature would inevitably generate new mysteries, new betrayals, new opportunities for those who possessed the wisdom to observe and the courage to act upon what they had observed. The village of Ashford-on-the-Weald would continue on, scarred but resilient, forever marked by the knowledge that murder and deception could flourish even in the most picturesque of settings, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever patient, would continue her own quiet work of observation, understanding that the real mysteries were never solved, merely paused between chapters in an endlessly unfolding narrative of human complexity.